Hello and welcome to the Career Corner, where we answer your career cues. I'm your host, Lukas Kauffman, and today we are joined by Vedant Akhauri to talk about his experience in audio production and the storytelling realm. Vedant, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucas. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
We're very happy to have you here on the Career Corner season. I can't even remember. It feels like a million. I've been doing it for a while, and it's going to be another good one here. So to start things off, just introduce yourself to the people. Tell us about yourself and where you work now and your experience in audio and storytelling and everything. Just hop right in.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. So currently I work as a content specialist for the Institute of Internal Auditors down here in Lake Mary, Florida. My main role with them is helping out with videos, but primarily podcasts. So we have like 6 podcasts. So I help record those, I edit them, and I do some variation of project management over the podcast, working with our editorial team, my production manager. So I've been doing that for almost a year now. But overall, I have 5 years of podcasting and radio experience. I began first as a newscaster for WICB and its magazine, Ithaca Now. I did that for about 3 years, and then I created a mini series for them in 2021 called Asian in Ithaca: Stories of Race, Culture, and Identity. But somewhere in those lines, I decided to start my own podcast called Let's Talk Media with Vedant Akhauri, which is basically this podcast where I usually bring people on to talk about various issues and trends in the media landscape, such as we need to fund local journalism more, and how there is, for example, say, a lot of colorism in Bollywood movies. But we also talk about like pop culture stuff like 1990s TV shows and media. We did a whole episode about that. And we also talk about like Euphoria and iCarly. So it's a mixture of, like the fun pop culture stuff, but also like a deep dive into the media landscape and what's affecting it. I just finished season 5 a few weeks ago, where I focus a lot on AI and job cuts in video games and journalism and marketing, production, design teams, like, the people who like design, what the products they're designing look like. So a lot of like industry stuff too. So it's just an amalgamation of the media landscape. Um, and I guess I would say that, throughout that, like I worked on my Bachelor of Science degree in TV radio production from Ithaca College, graduated 2021. And yeah, like I've just been a storyteller basically my entire life. I've just been naturally driven to, the universe and like, what we can show the world, because I do feel like, storytellers are the ears and eyes for the world. And so I feel like it's our responsibility to show the world, what people don't focus on. That's been my goal for a long, long time. And I've carried that throughout with radio and writing, but primarily through podcasting. So yeah, I've been doing that for a long time, and I'm excited to share my insights and experience with you and the listeners.
Incredible, incredible. So you're a very experienced podcaster, a veteran of the business at this point. Been doing it for so long. So before we dive into the deep questions, as an expert, how am I doing here? How are we doing on the Career Corner in terms of podcasting?
Well, the fact they said you've been doing this for what feels like a million seasons sounds like you know what you're doing at this point.
I sure hope so. I sure hope so. Now, you mentioned there, you talked about colorism in Bollywood movies, and I was reading your LinkedIn and saw that you grew up in India or were living in India for a period of time. I forget which one it was, but the media landscape is obviously very different here in America than it is around the world and in India. And I wanted to ask you, have the contrasting environments there influenced or changed the way that you approach storytelling?
Absolutely. So, um, I was born in Indianapolis, like Indianapolis, Indiana. But then my parents really wanted me to understand my Indian roots. So when I was 5, we moved to New Delhi, India. And then I lived there from ages 5 through almost 12. Then, once we lived there for quite some time, like 7 some years, we moved back to Florida. And I've been here ever since. So, ages 5 through 12, very crucial time in people's lives, very memorable in people's lives, very foundational. So yeah, I would say, like having grown up with both Indian content and then comparing it against American content has definitely shaped the way I see things. I can go into more detail on that unless you have any further questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to hear details and nuance that you have to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from what I recall, India is a lot more conservative in its media compared to United States. Um, And I think it basically began as, like there was a lot of censorship, a lot of, conservative parents. I mean, not like you see here. It was like a lot more extreme, I would say. Like some examples I can think of, like if there were, say, women in swimsuits on screen, they would crop out the women. If it was geared towards, all ages. Um, but one example I remember is an episode of an anime I grew up there called Doraemon, where there was an episode where the kids, they like the kid characters, they light up matchsticks, basically, but matchsticks were apparently too egregious and too inappropriate, so they just cut out all the matchstick parts. And they also cut out scenes in another episode where they're chopping onions because that's just apparently, too inappropriate for kids. And I mean, a lot of these examples also happen after I left the Indian ecosphere of media. Like I heard that Deadpool, even though it was released for adults, was heavily censored there. Like a lot of the blood, the swearing was taken out. And there was a movie, I think it came out in 2016 called Lipstick Under My Burqa, which was a very female empowerment kind of thing, positive message about women taking agency of their lives, but it was banned because it was too lady oriented, which is pretty backwards and sexist in my view, but that was kind of the ecosystem that I grew up under in India, very conservative, very squeaky clean, very play it safe. Um, and so, like I think that just developed this curiosity in me that okay, if I'm not gonna be able to see, the content that I want to see, maybe I'll just create my own stuff. And so, an example on my LinkedIn is that I wrote and directed a school play for a festival when I was 10 years old. And that was the culmination of me, just writing short stories with my friends in the library. I would draw comic books. I would write short stories with my cousins. My friends and I even wrote a video game where we were basically fighting Vilgax from Ben 10, but in locales around New Delhi. Like we had combo moves, we had plot lines. It was a lot of fun. So I've always been a storyteller at heart, but I think growing up under such a conservative and, for the lack of a better term, restrictive environment kind of sparked this curiosity in me to see what's not being shown to me on the TV or radio or the theater. And that just really sparked this creativity in me that I primarily, carried out through television and radio and now podcasting.
Yeah, incredible. Now, you've been doing this for a long time, right? Not just, professionally. You've been creating since you were,
Mhm.
in school, the festivals, the comic books with your friends. You've been making these stories, telling these stories. As somebody who started, creating and telling these stories so early, what are some skills that you developed during that time that you're surprised to kind of find yourself still using?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one skill that I learned is collaboration because, like when I directed that play, I was 10 years old, so I needed help from my drama teacher and my homeroom teacher and my classmates. They had to step in wherever 10-year-old me couldn't, and sometimes they would suggest revisions to the script. Um, and that's a skill that I carry even today. Like I work on podcasts, and so I talk to my producers sometimes where, sometimes we might have different ideas. So, but it's a collaborative effort. It's not like a you versus me thing. It's an us thing. And my friends and I sometimes we write scripts and sometimes we have different ideas, but we understand that it's a collaborative effort. So we try to hear each other out and try to create a cohesive collective product. The second thing I learned is, you know, that personal branding is very important. I think, like when you're writing, you're basically putting a piece of yourself in what you're putting out there. And so knowing, okay, this is the kind of stuff I write, this is my branding. Like, what is your elevator pitch? What is your unique selling points? I think the more you practice and figure things out, the more refined that becomes. And I've seen that, in the stuff I write now, where a lot of the stuff I write now is kind of similar to the stuff I wrote when I was 10 or 11, just obviously more matured, refined, more complex. So definitely branding is consistent there. Um, and the third one is having a thick skin. Like I began writing when I was 8. Um, and it taught me to have thick skin because I would have people like rip my writing apart saying this is garbage, this is bad. And there's a difference between constructive criticism and just outright, trolling and tearing people down. I think that's an important distinction that I learned to make. But I mean, there was a script that I wrote last week where, the person I was supposed to write it for just didn't like it at all. She was, I mean, not because it was written bad, just that because we had very different visions. But I didn't take it personally. It just rolled off of me. I was like, okay, thank you for the feedback. So that's a skill that builds, the longer you do it. Just learn to separate the emotions from the feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Great pieces of advice from developing so early. And along the same track, kind of, I fancy myself a storyteller as well. I like
Hmm.
to tell stories. I do some streaming, some YouTube videos, and interviews and podcasts and things like that. So I was wondering, what drew you to audio specifically as a method and as a vehicle for storytelling?
So I kind of fell into audio not intentionally. So obviously in high school, when I was in high school, Serial, the podcast, season 1 with Adnan Syed, that was huge. And I was in journalism. I was a journalism student in high school, and we would like listen to that in the classroom, and like during class we would listen to Serial season 1 and do writing assignments based on that. So Serial was huge, and then when I got to college, I had only intended to go into TV, but then you know I ran into this woman named Kristen, very amazing woman, Kristen. I love her, amazing person. So she worked for WICB back then, college radio station, and I started talking to her, and she said, "Hey, do you want to come to recruitment nights?" And so I gave it a try, and I was like, "Okay, I don't know if I'll stick in this beyond maybe a semester." And so I started doing newscasts, and I just found it fascinating how, audio storytelling to me gives a lot more freedom than video storytelling because you're not restricted by, having to create scenes or sets or even having to have the same quote unquote actors or talent in the same location. And so, in a lot of ways, I found audio just freeing, and that really allowed us to have a lot of fun with the kind of news packages we got to do for Ithaca Now. A lot of fun. Like there was, we did an award-winning news package on the COVID crisis in India. It won a Syracuse Press Club Awards and the New York State Broadcaster Awards in 2021. And so basically, it was me and Himadri, who was the news director, the incoming news director at the time for ICB. And so I recorded my parts from here in there in upstate New York, but she was in India due to COVID. So we just, recorded our stuff separately, conducted our interviews separately, you know, with a 12-hour or so time difference. But if you listen to it, you couldn't tell, right? That
Right,
we
yeah.
recorded everything separately. Um, and it was just a lot of fun, getting to play around with audio. And then I started listening to like other YouTube podcasts. Like there was this one podcast called the Recast, where it was a bunch of YouTubers who would, compare two episodes of a TV show that are very similar to each other and basically compare and contrast it. So an example might be Phineas and Ferb, the roller coaster episode, the original, and Phineas and Ferb roller coaster, the musical, an example like that. And that was like a 2, 3 hour podcast. I would listen to that religiously. And so as I began going into radio, I thought, okay, maybe I want to try something like that. And this was late 2019. So, podcast boom was still incoming. Like there was my friend Clay Davis. Some people might know him. He had a podcast called Energize, but I think he was pretty much the only one who had a podcast back then. And so I took that as inspiration that, okay, I'm going to do my own podcast. And so I began, brainstorming ideas. And one consistent theme was TV shows and movies. So I decided, I just literally walked up to my dad during winter break and said, Dad, I'm going to start a podcast. And he was like, okay, cool. So then I started recording the podcast. I had to borrow the WICB recording studio because this was literally like a few months before COVID, like spring 2020. And then, I just started getting the hang of it. And then COVID happened. And then I switched to remote, which made it a lot easier. But I also needed a passion project to do, and I think that's something that podcasting allows, students to do is, have something outside of school on your resume as practical experience. And, you know, as I continued my podcast, pretty much everybody I knew wanted to do a podcast or had a podcast. Like, I don't think the running joke was who has a podcast. The running joke was who doesn't have a podcast. Like you do
Right, yeah.
now. Everyone has one now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as far as I've seen, it's a trend that's going to continue. Podcasts is just exploding, and
Hmm.
especially with the capabilities to make a podcast and run one so smoothly with a, good production value remotely just opens it up to, anybody can have a podcast. So for people who are looking to get into podcasting or get into the world of audio, do you have any advice for getting started in that sphere?
So I'm doing a workshop tomorrow night, actually, coincidentally, about how we can, use podcasts, how people can get on podcasts, start their own podcasts, and I had some interesting statistics from that. So according to Spotify, as of July 2024, Spotify had more than 6 million podcasts on its platform, and
Wow.
yeah, millennials and Gen Z, they make up 62% almost of US podcast listeners. So, it's something that, young people listen to a lot. And, if you want to connect with young people, then there you go. And I found some other interesting statistics that the revenue is just booming in podcasting. Like I think they said by either 2026 or 7 that it's gonna be like a $7 billion industry. And yeah, that's awesome. And I'm very excited about the future of podcasting. Like, I said I work for the Institute of Internal Auditors, and they also launched their podcast series like 1 or 2 years ago, again, showing that, everybody sees this as a future and it's a trend that I think, we should invest more into. Yeah, I mean, podcasting is booming a lot. Like even like Ithaca Now, the news magazine I worked on, that went, from live recording in a studio to, doing it remotely and then releasing it concurrently on air and on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. At least when I was there. Um, so it is definitely an industry to be in if you want to grow your personal brand. But there are some advices that I do have. The first is that, you want to pick something that you can talk about for a long time, like a lot of episodes. Like when I started my podcast, it was originally 13 episodes. That was all I had planned, but now I'm at 96.
Wow.
Um, Thank you. So make sure that, you never know when a podcast that's just a small idea might balloon into something. So make sure it has legs to run on for a long time. And make sure that, you're not just doing it because it's, gonna get the views or because, it's what everybody's talking about. Because I think in this industry, people can tell right away if you're just chasing the trend. It has to be something that, people will listen to you, but also just comes from genuine passion and interests. Um, like, I'm very much, into like podcasts. And there was one podcast that I listened to where they talk a lot about the Olympics. Like they talk about just the Olympics. and I can tell that they have passion about that. And also the Recast podcast I listens to, they've been hugely passionate about that, and I can tell that they've built that over many years. So make sure it's genuine and it doesn't feel detached from what you want to do. And the third advice I would give is, you can very much burn out on your passion. It's very easy for creatives to burn out on podcasts. So, obviously, keep the hustle going, but also know when to take care of yourself. Like I've had life emergencies and stuff come up in the way, and it was a hard decision, but for the health of the podcast, I paused where I needed to. So make that very important, when you start a podcast. And I think the fourth and final advice I'd give is definitely networking. Like this is very important because podcasters support other podcasters, hopefully. And I don't mean that in a purely transactional way. Like get to know each other as people, because I think it's pretty easy to tell when somebody's only listening to you or talking to you just because they want to get something out of you, right? It's like a follow me, I'll follow you back thing on Instagram kind of thing. So some places that I've been on is like a few podcasting groups on Facebook and Discord. And I know that today's college kids might be a little too young for Facebook, but there are several comps out there, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm old Gen Z. But yeah, definitely find a community wherever you can because it can be grueling. Some episodes I have there like 2 hours long. It takes me like a whole day to get them. So definitely take care of yourself and your brand. And don't be discouraged if your first episode is rough or bad because it takes the time to find your rhythm and find your groove and kind of refine your podcast over time. And it just takes time. It's like a stone. Like the more you carve it down, the more it turns hopefully into a diamond. So definitely give yourself patience and a lot of hustle, but also a lot of self-care would be my advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice across the board, not just for podcasting. I think you could apply
Hmm.
all that to pretty much any discipline. And speaking of other disciplines, I know that you minored in psychology
Hmm.
while you were getting your degree, and I wanted to ask you how that has influenced your approach to the work that you do. Not just to, obviously want to highlight you and your work, but I think it's a great example of how, you can relate like something that's not necessarily you don't have to major in media to make a
Hmm.
podcast. You don't have to major in this to, you know, be in this sphere. So how did your minor in psychology influence the work that you do today?
Yeah, so like as a lifelong storyteller, been fascinated with people and what makes people what they are and what makes them act and think the way they do. And a huge focus of mine is abnormal psychology and developmental psychology. That was like my specialty as a psych minor at Ithaca. And I took a lot of like, abnormal psych, developmental psych, but I also took like media psychology with Dr. Scheib. I don't know if she's still there or not, but wonderful, wonderful class, wonderful professor too. And I think that it taught me, not only, what makes people, the way they are, but also why they are the way they are. And I definitely use that in a lot of stuff that I write. Like I've written publications about like, drug addiction, homelessness, the effects of like cyclical racism and cyclical violence, and analyze it from a psychoanalytical lens. But it's also taught me a lot about, how people psychologically analyze media. Um, and I actually did a fascinating episode this season about how we can use psychology, to basically, I interviewed a psychologist, Dr. Melissa Kim Corder, and she talked about how we can use psychological treatment by watching horror movies, basically. Yeah, if you watch horror movies, it will like help you identify your deepest fears, your deepest insecurities. It was fascinating stuff. And I think, psychology really helps us, as content creators because, we understand what makes people tick, what makes people feel heard, what makes people feel not heard, and how can we make them feel heard. And there are tons of creators like Mr. Beast, like he's a master at that, with his thumbnails evoking specific reactions to make you click on it. And there are tons of, podcasters that use that too. Like I work on a podcast called All Things Internal Audit Fraud Podcast, which is like a true crime podcast, but in the world of finance, basically people committing fraud. And so, to really settle people into the story, I use different music. So, like if we want to, make them feel tense, then I use that psychoanalysis. Like, okay, I'm going to use like, slow, creepy music, like something out of a Hereditary. But if I want people to, calm down and observe what they've heard, then maybe a little bit of a slower tempo, kind of like, wind them down. So music is definitely one that I think psychology has helped me a lot with. And I was also WIC's production director. So that helped me a lot with creating promos where, I used these emotions of, happiness, adrenaline, calmness to really, create final products that, resonated pretty well, I would say.
Incredible. Yeah, absolutely. And a great example of how you can apply something
Hmm.
that seems unrelated like psychology to your career. And music is looped in there too. You don't have to be in, you can apply whatever you've learned to something different and make something awesome. And Vedant, I think you've definitely done that. And before we close out on our time here, you've mentioned a lot of different things that you've worked on. So before we close out here, I want to give you the floor now to let people know where they can find you, where they can find your
Hmm.
podcast, and any information you want to include about how people can connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my podcast is called Let's Talk Media with Vedant Akhauri. That's Vedant Akhauri. And you can find that podcast on Instagram at Let's Talk Media VA. Um, yeah, that's where you can find my podcast. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Basically wherever you get your podcast, your favorite listening apps. And I've been doing that for 5 years now, and I'm about to, do season 6. Hopefully in a few months, I have a bunch of guests lined up. So if by any chance you want to come on, then feel free to reach out to me on that. And you can find my LinkedIn is Vedant Akhauri. I think Lukas might put that in the bio. So if you want to talk to me about podcasting or writing or media, anything, TV, film, radio, you can just find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty addicted to LinkedIn, I will say. So I think I'll respond immediately. So you can find me there professionally. Yeah, that's that. Podcasting and yeah, that's all I have.
Amazing. Vedant, thank you so much for joining us today in the Career Corner.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be on and share my insights on
Yeah,
podcasting.
absolutely. I'll see you in the world of podcasting. And folks at home, you don't have to wait for our next episode to get career guidance. You can visit Drop In Hours in Muller Faculty Center 101, Monday through Friday, 11 to 2. I think I still got that right. Hopefully it's memorized. We'll fix it later if I didn't. Folks, thanks for watching. Vedant, thanks for coming on. Everybody, this has been Career Corner.